The trembling wouldn't stop. Roger Wilkins sat in the stifling heat of a makeshift military tribunal, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he stared down at the blueprints spread before a panel of stern-faced officers. Sweat trickled down his temples, but it wasn't the July heat of 1944 causing his distress. The tremors had been his constant companion for 3 months now, ever since he'd made the desperate modification to the hydraulic control systems of 72 P-47 Thunderbolts headed for the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. 3 months since he'd broken every engineering protocol in the Army Air Force's handbook. 3 months since he'd saved hundreds of pilots while damning himself. "Mr. Wilkins, do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Colonel James Matheson's voice cut through the stale air of the repurposed farmhouse outside Chelmsford. "You modified critical flight control systems without authorization.
Systems that keep those birds in the air." Roger tried to still his hands. Impossible. The nerve damage from the hydraulic fluid burns had seen to that. He'd never hold a proper drafting pencil again. Never return to his engineering position at Republic Aviation. Never design another aircraft component. But then, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Not after what it had cost him. 72 planes, Mr. Wilkins, the colonel continued, tapping a folder thick with after-action reports. 72 of our Thunderbolts pulling maneuvers that machine was never designed to execute. Outturning Messerschmitts of low altitude, surviving engagements that should have been death sentences. What do you say when your crime is saving too many lives the wrong way? How does a civilian contractor with a desperate idea become the reason 3 fighter groups stopped losing half their pilots over Germany?
And how does that same man end up facing charges that could send him to military prison for the rest of his natural life? The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive, seemingly cumbersome American fighter plane that the German pilots initially mocked as the Juggernaut, is well documented in the annals of air warfare. Weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded, the Republic P-47 was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. It was a bruiser, not a ballerina. A flying tank that could absorb punishment and deliver it through 8.50 caliber machine guns. But in the deadly ballet of air combat over Europe in 1943, the one thing it couldn't do might doom hundreds of American boys. It couldn't turn tight enough to escape the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s of the Luftwaffe. That's where Roger Wilkins enters our story. Not as the celebrated aeronautical genius he'd once dreamed of becoming, but as the man who would break every rule to give those young men a fighting chance. A man who would pay for that decision with his health, his career, and very nearly his freedom. 6 months earlier, in the frigid January of 1944, Roger had been just another civilian engineer at Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island. Brilliant, but unremarkable in the corporate hierarchy. One of dozens of technicians poring over performance reports from the front lines, looking for ways to squeeze another few horsepower from the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, or shave a few pounds from the airframe without compromising structural integrity. The son of a mechanic from Allentown, Pennsylvania, Roger had worked his way through engineering school at night while assembling aircraft components during the day. His hands had always been his greatest asset. Steady, precise, with an intuitive feel for how metal and machinery should work together. Those same hands now betrayed him with every involuntary tremor, a cruel reminder of the price he'd paid for his unauthorized ingenuity. "The first time I saw the combat footage, I couldn't sleep for a week," Roger would later tell a young reporter from the Smithsonian, decades after the war, his damaged hands still trembling as he nursed a tepid cup of coffee. "Our boys were sitting ducks in those turning fights. The P-47 was fast in a dive and fast in level flight, but put one in a tight turn against a 109, and he didn't need to finish the thought. The grim statistics told the story. In the winter of 1943-44, the 8th Air Force was losing fighter pilots at an unsustainable rate, with the heaviest losses coming during the turning engagements that became inevitable during bomber escort missions. The footage Roger referred to had come from gun cameras mounted in the P-47s.
grainy, black-and-white images of aerial combat that revealed the Thunderbolt's fatal weakness in excruciating detail. One sequence in particular haunted him. A P-47 pilot desperately trying to turn inside a Messerschmitt's gun arc, the German fighter effortlessly staying on his tail, the bright flash of cannon fire, and then static as the American plane tumbled from the sky. That pilot had been 22-year-old Lieutenant Alan Prescott from Tulsa, Oklahoma. His body was never recovered from the wreckage that scattered across a Belgian field. He left behind a fiancée named Eleanor and parents who received the standard telegram expressing the nation's regrets. Just one of hundreds who died in similar circumstances, caught in turning fights they couldn't win. The P-47's problem was fundamental to its design. The massive fighter, with its substantial wing loading, simply couldn't generate the lift required to make the tight, defensive turns needed to shake a Messerschmitt off its tail. The conventional wisdom at Republic and throughout the Army Air Forces was clear: accept the Thunderbolt's limitations and play to its strengths. Dive away from trouble. Use the superior roll rate. Never get lured into a turning fight. Good advice if you're at 25,000 feet with room to dive. Useless if you're at 5,000 feet with a Focke-Wulf on your tail and nowhere to go but around. The thing about the hydraulic boost system in the P-47, Roger explained, his engineer's precision still evident despite the years, was that it was actually overbuilt for the standard operating parameters. It was designed to apply consistent pressure at high speeds where control surfaces become difficult to move. But in a turning fight, what the pilots needed wasn't consistency, they needed responsiveness. This insight came to him not in some flash of brilliance, but through the desperate plea of a test pilot who had survived combat tours in Europe. Major David Callahan had cornered Roger after a routine design meeting, gripping his arm with an intensity that brooked no argument. Callahan wasn't just any pilot. He'd flown 37 combat missions in P-47s with the 56th Fighter Group before being rotated back to the States as a test pilot and liaison officer. He'd seen 16 of his squadron mates shot down, most of them trapped in the very turning predicaments that the flight manuals insisted they should avoid. "They're dying up there, Rog," Callahan had said, his voice low but urgent. "The kids are dying because they get into these turning contests and can't get out. The book says don't turn with a 109, but sometimes you don't have a choice."
And when that happens, he'd looked away then, but not before Roger saw the hollow look that haunted too many returning pilots. That night, Roger had stayed late at the plant, reviewing the hydraulic system schematics by the light of a single desk lamp. The P-47's boost system was a marvel of engineering, using engine-driven pumps to provide the force needed to move control surfaces at high speed. But what if the system could be modified? What if, instead of maintaining constant pressure, it could provide variable boost based on the pilot's input force? The idea was either brilliant or suicidal, depending on who you asked. By bypassing the pressure regulator and installing a direct force feedback loop, the system would amplify the pilot's inputs more dramatically at lower speeds, precisely when in a turning fight. It would make the massive P-47 surprisingly agile in exactly the regime where Luftwaffe pilots thought they had the advantage.
It would also, as his supervisor Charles Harmon pointed out the next morning, risk catastrophic failure of the entire hydraulic system if pushed beyond certain limits. "You're talking about removing safety systems, Roger," Harmon had said, pushing the schematics back across the desk. "Systems that are there for a reason. Push those hydraulics beyond spec and the whole thing could rupture. Best case, the pilot loses control. Worst case..." He'd made a diving motion with his hand, whistling softly as it crashed into his desktop. Harmon wasn't being obstinate. He had 20 years of aeronautical engineering experience and had seen well-intentioned modifications lead to disaster. The graveyard of experimental aircraft was filled with the remains of planes whose designers had pushed beyond established safety parameters. And in wartime production, with thousands of young men's lives at stake, caution was the watchword. "We'll run it through the proper channels," Harmon promised.
Submit it to the modification committee. If it passes muster, maybe we can implement it in the P-47 D-30 production block. That would take months, perhaps the better part of a year. Months during which P-47 pilots would continue to die in turning fights they couldn't win. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it. A potentially interesting idea relegated to the too risky file, while engineers pursued more conservative improvements. But the winter of 1944 was not a normal time. The air war over Europe had reached a critical phase. German fighters were exacting a terrible toll on American bomber formations, and the P-47s tasked with protecting them were finding themselves outmatched in the swirling dogfights that developed when Luftwaffe pilots pushed through to attack the vulnerable B-17s and B-24s. Major Callahan returned from a liaison visit to the 8th Air Force in England with grim reports. The 56th Fighter Group, the legendary Wolf Pack, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, had lost 17 pilots in the past month alone. The 78th and 353rd weren't faring much better, and in the after-action reports, a pattern emerged. P-47s caught in turning engagements at medium to low altitudes were simply unable to escape. "I can't go through official channels with this, Roger," Callahan had said during a clandestine meeting at a diner far from the Republic plant. "There's too much red tape, too many committees. By the time they approve any modification, hundreds more kids will be dead." The major slid a folded paper across the Formica tabletop. It contained a list of 72 serial numbers, P-47Ds in final preparation for shipment to England. "These planes are heading out next week," Callahan continued. "They're going straight to the 56th, 78th, and 353rd. Straight into the meat grinder." What happened next would alter the course of the air war and Roger Wilkins' life forever. Using his position as a quality control engineer, Roger gained access to a batch of 72 P-47D models awaiting final inspection before shipment to England. Over 3 fevered nights, working with just 2 trusted mechanics sworn to secrecy, he modified the hydraulic boost systems according to his untested design. No official tests, no safety protocols, no documentation. Just the desperate gamble of a man convinced he could save lives, even if it meant risking his career and freedom. The modifications required precise work in cramped spaces. The hydraulic boost system ran through the control column and into the wings, requiring access panels to be removed and delicate adjustments to pressure valves and feedback mechanisms. Each aircraft took nearly 2 hours to modify, with Roger personally verifying every connection, every seal, every adjustment. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenge, Roger would recall years later. It was knowing that if I was wrong, I'd be sending those boys up in planes that might fail them at the worst possible moment. I didn't sleep for those 3 days, couldn't eat, just kept running the calculations over and over in my head. The 2 mechanics who assisted him, Jacob Steinberg and Frank DiMaggio, understood the gravity of what they were doing. Both had brothers flying combat missions in Europe. Both knew the risks they were taking with their careers. Neither hesitated when Roger explained his plan. "My brother Sammy is over there in a Thunderbolt," Steinberg had said simply. "If this gives him a better chance, I'm in." On the 3rd night, disaster struck. As Roger was making final adjustments to the last P-47 in the batch, a high-pressure hydraulic line ruptured, spraying him with fluid at over 1,000 pounds per square inch. The caustic fluid soaked through his coveralls instantly, causing severe chemical burns to his arms, chest, and hands. His screams alerted a night watchman, and Roger was rushed to the hospital. But the modified P-47s, their secret alterations undiscovered amid the chaos, continued on their journey to the European theater. Packed into crates, loaded onto transport ships, and sent across the submarine-infested Atlantic to assemble fields in England where ground crews would put them together, unaware of the unauthorized changes hidden within their hydraulic systems. The first reports came back within weeks. Pilots from the 56th Fighter Group, flying what they thought were standard P-47Ds, reported something extraordinary. Their Thunderbolts were turning inside Messerschmitt 109s at speeds below 300 miles per hour. Maneuvers that had previously been suicidal were now not just possible, but advantageous.
In the critical altitude band between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, where so many desperate battles were fought, the modified P-47s demonstrated an agility that confounded both their pilots and the enemy. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who would go on to become one of the highest-scoring Thunderbolt aces with 28 confirmed kills, described his amazement in a letter home. "This new batch of jugs handles like nothing I've flown before. Got jumped by two 109s yesterday while escorting the big friends back from Bremen. Instead of diving away like they teach us, I hauled back on the stick and pulled inside both of them. You should have seen their faces as I came around on their tails. Got one confirmed, one probable. Something's different with these planes, and whatever they did back home, I hope they keep doing it." Similar reports poured in from other pilots flying the modified aircraft. The kill ratios for these specific P-47s jumped dramatically. The 56th Fighter Group, which had been losing an average of 15 pilots per month, suddenly saw losses drop to just 3 in February 1944, while their confirmed kills more than doubled. The planes that had once been derided by the Luftwaffe as lumbering juggernauts were now being approached with newfound respect and caution. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th, noted the change in his official reports. Aircraft serial numbers 42-75627 through 42-75699 demonstrate markedly superior turning performance compared to earlier models.
Prioritätsallokation von similar aircraft für alle squadrons. Englische Piloten zu noticed the difference. Intercepted radio transmissions revealed confusion und Konsternation among Luftwaffe units. One captured pilot vom Jagdgeschwader 26 auf Behn interrogiert über rezente Losses expressed Bewilderung. Die Thunderbolts we faced last month were different. They could turn mit unseren 109s, wenn sie nicht in der Lage sein dürften. Wir hatten keine Warnung von dieser Capability. But the mysterious improvement couldn't remain unexplained forever. When maintenance crews began reporting ungewöhnliche Wear Patterns in den hydraulischen Systemen von bestimmten P-74, eine Investigation war gelauncht. Within days, die unerlaubte Modifikation wurde entdeckt und der Trial lehrte direkt back zu Roger Wilkins, still recovering in a Long Island Hospital von den Bernen, die all ihm mit permanenter Nervenschäden lässten und den charakteristischen Tremor, der das Leben verändern würde.
The military's response was swift and severe. Roger was detained by MPs as soon as he was well enough to leave the hospital. His two accomplices, Steinberg and DiMaggio, were similarly arrested. The modified P-47s were immediately grounded pending a full engineering review. And in the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, a heated debate erupted over what to do about the maverick engineer who had broken every rule in the book and saved perhaps hundreds of American lives in the process. The immediate concern was safety. Had Wilkins sent 72 pilots up in death traps? Initial inspections suggested not. Despite the unauthorized nature of the modifications, they appeared to be expertly implemented. But without proper testing, no one could be certain how the alterations would hold up under sustained combat conditions. Major General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, made the controversial decision to allow a squadron of the modified P-47s to continue limited operations while the rest underwent detailed inspection. His reasoning was pragmatic. If these aircraft are indeed superior in combat, grounding them all could cost American lives. If they're unsafe, we need to know that too. Better to find out under controlled conditions than risk catastrophic failures across the fleet. Which brings us back to that stifling room in Chelmsford, England, where Roger Wilkins sat before a tribunal that would decide his fate. His accomplices had already been dealt with. Steinberg and DiMaggio received formal reprimands but avoided court-martial when it became clear they had been following Roger's lead and believed they were acting to save lives. "The data is unambiguous, Colonel," said Major Thomas Reed, the technical officer on the panel, gesturing to the performance charts spread before them. Wilkins' modification increased the P-47's turning performance by nearly 23% in the critical spiel range. Combat reports confirm that pilots flying these aircraft achieved a kill ratio 3 times higher than those in standard models. The numbers told an impressive story.
In the 2 months since the modified Thunderbolts had entered service, they had been credited with destroying 147 enemy aircraft while losing only 12 of their own, a ratio that far exceeded the norm. Pilots specifically mentioned improved turning capability in 63% of after-action reports involving the modified planes. "And the safety concerns?" Colonel Matheson asked, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing, sir," Reed replied, a note of reluctant admiration in his voice. "We've put these modifications through rigorous testing now, run them to failure in the lab. The system does indeed risk catastrophic rupture, but only when pushed far beyond what any pilot could physically endure. The G-forces would render a man unconscious long before the hydraulics failed." So Wilkins was right. Yes, sir, he was right. His calculations were perfect, which makes what he did all the more inexcusable from a procedural standpoint. The findings put the tribunal in an impossible position. Roger Wilkins had unquestionably violated military protocols, ignored the chain of command, and potentially endangered aircraft and pilots with untested modifications. By any normal standard, his actions warranted severe punishment, perhaps even imprisonment. But those same actions had saved lives, American lives, the sons of voters back home. And they'd resulted in a significant tactical advantage over the enemy at a critical phase of the air war. Colonel Matheson turned his attention back to Roger. "You understand the position you've put us in, Mr. Wilkins. You circumvented every safety protocol we have, violated direct orders from your superiors, potentially endangered the lives of our pilots." "With respect, Colonel," Roger replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands, "I believed I was saving those lives. The statistical projections were clear. Without improved turning capability, we were losing 27% of P-47 pilots engaged in turning combat below 15,000 feet. That translated to approximately 48 deaths per month across the groups flying Thunderbolts." "And you appointed yourself the man to make that decision?" "Someone had to, sir." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Colonel Matheson spoke again. "The irony, Mr. Wilkins, is that your modification works. Works so well, in fact, that Republic Aviation is now implementing a version of it in all new production P-47s, following proper testing and certification, of course." Roger's expression remained unchanged. "I'm glad to hear that, sir. But that doesn't change the fact that you broke the chain of command, created a potential catastrophe. For that, there must be consequences." What followed was 3 more hours of deliberation, with Roger waiting outside the makeshift hearing room. When he was called back in, the verdict was delivered with military precision. The tribunal found him guilty of violating Articles 92 and 108 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey an order or regulation, and damage to military property. As a civilian contractor, he wasn't subject to the full weight of military justice, but his actions fell under war production regulations. The verdict, when it came, was a study in military pragmatism. Roger Wilkins would not face prison time. The success of his modification and the lives it had saved made that politically impossible. Instead, he was officially reprimanded, barred from any further government contract work, and quietly sent back to the United States with a medical discharge that cited his injuries without mentioning their cause. His engineering career was over. The tremors in his hands saw to that. But in an ironic twist that only war can produce, the modification he had created, now officially designated the Enhanced Maneuverability Hydraulic System, became standard on all P-47D-30 models and later variants. The Republic Aviation engineers who formalized and documented his work received commendations. His name appeared nowhere in the official technical manuals. By the spring of 1945, over 6,000 P-47 Thunderbolts were flying with variations of Roger's hydraulic system. Pilots credited the improved turning capability with saving countless lives in the desperate air battles over Germany. The once maligned Jug ended the war with an impressive record, P-47 pilots claim to have shot down 7,385 enemy aircraft while losing only 822 of their own in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of nearly 9-to-1. The numbers alone tell only part of the story. Behind each statistic was a young American pilot who came home instead of dying over occupied Europe. Men like Captain James Harwick of the 353rd Fighter Group, who wrote in his diary, "Got bounced by two 190s today while escorting the heavies back from Schweinfurt. 6 months ago, that would have been a death sentence. But this new jug turns like you wouldn't believe. Got away clean and even managed to tag one of them as he overshot me. Whatever they did to these planes, they should give that engineer a medal that would never come."
In fact, the opposite occurred, a deliberate effort to obscure Rogers' contribution. In the official history of the P-47's development, his unauthorized modification was recharacterized as a planned improvement implemented through standard channels. His name was purged from technical records. The true story was classified, ostensibly to prevent other contractors from taking similar liberties. How many of those victories stemmed directly from Rogers' forbidden modification? Military historians still debate the numbers, but conservative estimates suggest at least 1,000 enemy aircraft fell to P-47s that might otherwise have escaped had the Thunderbolts maintained their original turning limitations. 1,000 victories, translating to hundreds of American pilots who returned home instead of perishing over Nazi Germany. After the war, Roger Wilkins faded into obscurity. His trembling hands prevented him from returning to engineering work.
The chemical burns had left him with chronic pain and limited mobility. For a time, he taught mathematics at a community college in New Jersey, his students unaware of his pivotal role in the air war over Europe. He never married, never sought recognition, never spoke publicly about what he had done until that Smithsonian interview in the late 1970s, when a persistent aviation historian tracked him down. "I don't regret it," he told the young reporter then, looking down at his perpetually shaking hands. "Not for a minute. You have to understand what it was like then. Every day, we'd get the casualty reports. Every day, more names. More kids who weren't coming home. If you knew you could do something to stop that, even if it meant breaking every rule they had, wouldn't you? Wouldn't anyone?" When asked about the personal cost, his health, his career, his future, Roger had simply smiled. A tired smile that carried 3 decades of living with his decision.
"Some prices are worth paying," he said. "I can live with shaky hands. I couldn't have lived with the alternative." There were other costs beyond the physical. After his return to the States, Roger found himself under FBI surveillance, his unauthorized actions during wartime having marked him as potentially subversive. Job opportunities mysteriously evaporated. His parents, bewildered by their son's sudden fall from grace, stood by him without ever fully understanding what he had done or why it had ended his promising career. In a cruel twist, the nerve damage from the hydraulic fluid progressed over time, eventually requiring Roger to use a wheelchair. The Veterans Administration initially denied his disability claims, citing the classified nature of his service and the unofficial status of his injuries. It took a congressional intervention in 1962, 18 years after the incident, to secure him the medical benefits he desperately needed.
Through it all, he maintained his silence about the true nature of his contribution. Until that Smithsonian interview, most of his acquaintances knew only that he had been an engineer during the war who had suffered some sort of industrial accident. Even his closest friends were unaware that hundreds of pilots owed their lives to his act of insubordination. Roger Wilkins died in 1982, his obituary noting only his service as a civilian contractor during World War II. No mention of the lives he saved. No recognition of the pilots who returned home because a desperate engineer decided that rules mattered less than results. His grave in a small New Jersey cemetery bears a simple marker with his name, dates, and a single line: "He did what needed doing." But in the annals of air combat history, the legacy of his pointless mechanism lives on. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided for its poor turning capability, became one of the most formidable fighters of the war,
a transformation made possible by one man's willingness to risk everything to give those young pilots a fighting chance. The technical aspects of Rogers' modification were, in fact, deceptively simple. The standard P-47 hydraulic boost system used a pressure regulator that maintained a consistent level of force assistance regardless of the pilot's input or the aircraft's speed. This was considered ideal for predictable handling characteristics across the flight envelope, a primary concern for an aircraft that regularly operated from near sea level to over 30,000 feet, and from landing speeds to well over 400 miles per hour in a dive. What Roger recognized was that this consistency came at a cost. At lower speeds, precisely when engaged in turning dogfights, pilots needed more assistance to move the heavy control surfaces quickly enough to match the nimble German fighters. His modification essentially created a variable ratio system that provided proportionally greater boost at lower airspeeds, when aerodynamic forces on the control surfaces were reduced, but quick response was most critical. The brilliance was in the implementation. Rather than requiring a complex new system that would be difficult to retrofit, Rogers' design used existing components rearranged with subtle modifications. He maintained fail-safes to prevent complete hydraulic failure, but sacrificed some of the redundancies that engineers normally insisted upon, a calculated risk that his testing suggested would never come into play under real-world conditions. One of the most remarkable aspects of the story is that not a single one of the 72 modified P-47s ever experienced a catastrophic hydraulic failure of the type that Rogers' supervisor had feared. The system proved remarkably robust, even under the stress of combat operations. In fact, maintenance records showed that the modified planes actually suffered fewer control system issues overall, likely because pilots were applying less extreme forces to the controls thanks to the variable boost assistance. Perhaps most telling about Rogers' character was a detail that emerged only decades later from the declassified maintenance records of those original 72 modified P-47s. Each aircraft contained a small brass plate hidden inside the control column housing where only maintenance crews would ever see it, with a simple engraved message. "If this system fails, I'm sorry. It was my call, not yours." R.W. He had been willing to take full responsibility, even posthumously, should his gamble have failed. In the decades since, hydraulic control systems in fighter aircraft have evolved dramatically, incorporating variations of the variable pressure concept that Roger pioneered under such desperate circumstances. Modern fly-by-wire systems in today's combat aircraft owe a conceptual debt to his insight that controls should respond differently based on flight regime and pilot input force. Though few aerospace engineers today would recognize his name, elements of his desperate innovation live on in the DNA of aircraft design. The true extent of Rogers' contribution remained classified until 1997, when documents relating to the P-47's development were finally declassified under the Historical Review Program. Aviation historians were stunned to discover the real story behind the Thunderbolt's mid-war performance improvement. Several scholarly articles followed, finally giving Roger Wilkins the professional recognition he had been denied in life. In 2004, a small ceremony was held at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where a plaque acknowledging his contribution was added to the P-47 exhibit. His nephew, Michael Wilkins, accepted the honor on behalf of the family, remarking poignantly, "Uncle Roger never sought recognition. He only wanted to keep those young men alive. But it matters that the truth is finally known, that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not in the cockpit, but on the drawing board." The contrast between Rogers' obscurity and the fame accorded to other wartime innovators is striking. While men like Barnes Wallis, inventor of the bouncing bomb, and Frank Whittle, jet engine pioneer, became celebrated figures in aviation history, Rogers' contribution remained hidden, classified, and ultimately uncredited for most of his lifetime. The difference? They worked within the system,
through approved channels, while Roger chose direct action when those channels proved too slow for the urgent needs of combat pilots. Yet the impact of his work rivals theirs in lives saved and battles won. Fighter pilots who flew both the early P-47 models and the later officially modified versions consistently reported that the turning capability made the difference between survival and disaster in countless engagements. Wing Commander Robert Stanford Tuck of the RAF, who flew the Thunderbolt briefly while visiting American units, remarked that the improved models transformed a decent fighter into a truly exceptional one, particularly in the circumstances where you'd previously consider yourself most vulnerable. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came not from the military or the aviation industry, but from one of the pilots whose life was likely saved by Roger's modification.
Captain Michael Townsend, who flew a modified P-47 with the 56th Fighter Group through 37 combat missions, wrote in his memoir, "They never told us what changed in those planes, never explained why suddenly our Thunderbolts could turn with the best the Luftwaffe had to offer. But whatever nameless engineer back home figured it out, I owe him my life. We all did. Some unknown guy with a pencil and slide rule who probably never fired a shot in anger gave us the tool we needed to come home." For Roger Wilkins, that anonymous gratitude would have been enough. The tremors that plagued him for the rest of his life served as a constant reminder of his choice, to risk his own future so that others might have one. In the brutal calculus of war, it was a trade he made willingly and never regretted. The story of Roger Wilkins and his pointless mechanism raises profound questions about bureaucracy, innovation, and moral courage in wartime. What is the proper balance between adherence to procedure and the imperative to save lives? How do we value the contributions of those who work outside the system, even when their actions prove correct? And most challenging of all, how do we honor someone whose greatest accomplishment had to remain hidden? In 2015, the last remaining pilot known to have flown one of the original 72 modified P-47s passed away. Colonel Richard Stanton had scored 6 confirmed kills in his Thunderbolt, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and the lasting respect of his peers. At his funeral, among his personal effects was found a curious item: a small hydraulic valve mounted on a wooden plaque with a handwritten note attached. The note read simply, "The part that saved my life. Thank you, whoever you were." He had never known Roger Wilkins's name, never learned the identity of the engineer whose unauthorized modification had given him the edge he needed in the skies over Germany. But he had somehow acquired that valve, perhaps from a maintenance crew during the war, perhaps from a museum later, and kept it all those years as a talisman, a reminder that survival sometimes depends on someone willing to break the rules. As we look back on the technological innovations of World War II, the dramatic tales of radar, jet engines, and atomic research often overshadow smaller breakthroughs that nevertheless saved countless lives. Roger Wilkins's hydraulic modification, deemed too risky by his superiors, implemented in secret, and vindicated in combat, stands as a testament to the power of individual initiative in the face of institutional caution, a reminder that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to change the game. If this story has stayed with you, consider what it means to take such a risk, to see a problem that others ignore or accept, and to act decisively even at great personal cost. In our own lives, we rarely face decisions with stakes as high as those Roger Wilkins confronted. But his example challenges us to consider: what systems around us need changing? What rules, designed with the best intentions, might be costing lives or livelihoods? And most importantly, would we have the courage to act as he did, knowing the price that might come due? In the skies over Nazi Germany, American pilots in P-47 Thunderbolts suddenly found they could turn inside enemy fighters, a capability they'd been told was impossible. In a small room in England, a man with trembling hands faced judgment for giving them that chance. And in the decades since, the hidden story of Roger Wilkins reminds us that the most consequential acts of heroism sometimes leave no monuments, only the quiet knowledge of lives saved and a personal price willingly paid. Continue exploring the quiet contradictions that define humanity's darkest hours, and if this story stayed with you, leave your mark below so others can find it too.